Settle in, dear viewer, for tonight we return to the gaslit streets of late 19th century New Orleans. Detective Ambrose Sinclair has just been pulled into his most unsettling case yet, a mysterious death with no witnesses and an impossible crime scene. If you find peace in these dark tales, please leave a like to help support the channel. Now, close your eyes as we begin tonight's journey. The courtyard smelled of rain and crushed jasmine. It was well past midnight, and the French Quarter had gone quiet in the way it only does before dawn, when the last of the tavern patrons have staggered home and the first of the bread carts have not yet creaked onto the cobblestones. Behind a high brick wall on Dumaine Street, the body of Julien Castellan, a man of considerable wealth and considerable enemies, lay motionless beside his courtyard fountain. Officer Murphy was the first to hear of Castellan's gruesome discovery. He had been walking his beat near the corner of Domaine and Royal when the housekeeper's scream cut through the night air. He ran and tried the courtyard gate from the street, but it was locked and would not budge. By the time the burly Irishman climbed the courtyard wall, he found the scene exactly as it would remain for the next several hours. Nothing touched, nothing moved. A dead man in a locked garden, as still as the statues around him. The house behind the courtyard was one of the finest on the block, its shutters painted a deep Creole blue, its balcony railings twisted into elaborate iron scrollwork that caught the gaslight like black lace. Julien Castellan had built that house on the profits of rare maps and older manuscripts, the kind of trade that rewards patience and punishes trust. He had not been an easy man to like, and in the hours after his death, that fact would matter a great deal. Word reached the Sinclair Detective and Investigations Agency just after 4 in the morning. Ambrose Sinclair had not been asleep. He rarely was at that hour, preferring instead to sit at his elaborate study desk with a glass of something amber and a stack of case files he had already solved twice in his head. When the knock came, sharp and urgent, he was already reaching for his coat before he opened the door. Officer Dubois stood on the step, his Creole drawl clipped short by the seriousness of the hour. "Detective, you'll want to see this one yourself." "A body?" Sinclair asked, already stepping past him toward the waiting carriage. "A body in a locked courtyard," Dubois said. "No way in, no way out. The captain said if anyone could make sense of it, it would be you." "And your partner, Murphy? Where is he in all this?" "Already there, keeping the curious away," Dubois said. "There's a small crowd gathering already, Detective. News like this doesn't stay quiet long in this city." Sinclair allowed himself a small, private smile. The Sinclair Detective and Investigations Agency was the first of its kind in New Orleans. He knew that when the New Orleans constabulary came knocking in the middle of the night, that they were looking at a crime with no easy solution. If solving these mysteries was easy, Sinclair would have chosen a different line of work. The carriage rattled through streets still dark and slick from an earlier rain. Sinclair watched the balconies pass by, their iron railings dripping, the gas lamps throwing long amber reflections across the wet stone. New Orleans at this hour had a hush to it that he found almost sacred, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the distant call of a riverboat horn drifting up from the wharves. Somewhere behind them, a church bell marked the hour, 5 slow tolls fading into the damp air. "What do you know of the household?" Sinclair asked. "Not much yet," Dubois said. Castellan lived alone, mostly. A housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and a cook who comes by day only. His wife lives apart from him now, has done for the better part of a year. There's bad blood there from what I hear. There is bad blood everywhere with a man like Castellan, Sinclair said quietly, more to himself than to Dubois. The question is whose blood ran hot enough to kill. Sinclair had met Castellan on a number of occasions, mixing as he does among New Orleans' society crowd. He wasn't an admirer of either his demeanor or barely concealed fraudulent money-making. Sinclair had heard stories of how Castellan made quite the profit for himself by convincing many European aristocrats that the old Spanish maps he had just sold them were in fact Ponce de Leon's prize map to the Fountain of Youth. Many had found out the truth when bragging of their acquisition to their friends, who happened to possess a map of similar pedigree themselves. When he arrived at the Castellan house, the housekeeper, a stout woman named Odile, was seated on the front steps wrapped in a shawl, her hands shaking around a cup of untouched tea. Murphy stood near the gate, arms crossed, his broad frame blocking the view of anyone who might wander too close. "Detective Sinclair," Murphy said, "we had to come over the wall. The gate's bolted from the inside, and the door from the house is locked tight. Odile here says the key's been sitting in the hall bowl all night." Sinclair studied the wall. Brick, at least 10 feet high, capped with broken glass set into the mortar, an old trick to discourage burglars. He looked up at it for a long moment before speaking. "No one climbed that without cutting themselves," he said. "Let's see the man himself." Inside the courtyard, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and jasmine vines that curled along the far wall. A small fountain trickled quietly in the center, undisturbed, its stone basin dark with moss and rainwater. Ferns crowded the borders in heavy green clusters. As Sinclair took in the scene, he saw a cat sitting in the shadows watching the strangers with wary yellow eyes before slipping away over the wall through a gap. Julian Castellan lay near the fountain's edge, his silver-headed cane still resting against the bench where he must have been sitting when he died. His face was calm. Too calm, Sinclair thought, for a man who had met a sudden end. He knelt beside the body and looked closely at the hands, the collar, the shoes. No blood, no bruising, no sign of a struggle at all. He glanced down at the soft mud ringing the fountain and found only one set of prints there, small and even, matching the dead man's own house shoes. "No one else came near him," Sinclair said. "Not through here, at least." "None that we can find," Murphy said. "And no knife, no pistol, nothing of the sort turned up either." Dubois and I looked the whole garden over twice. "No weapon," Sinclair repeated slowly, turning the thought over. "Then whatever killed him, he did not see coming." "Perhaps he didn't see it coming because it was natural causes," Dubois suggested. "Always a possibility, but Mr. Castellan was in fact murdered," Sinclair said quietly. "Look at the lips, that faint blue tinge, and the pupils still wide even in this light." "Poison," Murphy grunted in disgust. "Poison in a locked garden," Dubois said, shaking his head. "Someone would still have had to get it to him." "Precisely," Sinclair said, rising to his feet and brushing the mud from his knees. "Which means our killer was either already inside this house or found a way in that none of us have considered yet." He turned his attention to the walls again, then to the roof line of the neighboring building, a 2-story structure that shared a party wall with the Castellan property. His eyes lingered there a moment longer than anywhere else, though he said nothing of it yet. "Who found him?" Sinclair asked. "Odile," Murphy said. "Says she had gotten up to make his morning tea, same as always, but noticed his bedroom door was open. When she looked inside, It appeared Castellan hadn't gone to bed. She looked around until she finally found him like this. She says the gate was already bolted from the inside when she tried it, same as every night. And when does she say she last saw her employer? Sinclair inquired. Around dinner last night, she says, Murphy said. Later, she left his evening tea in the garden and then retired to her quarters. Dinner and tea, Dubois observed. 2 ways to poison someone you don't fancy much. Sinclair walked to the small table beside the bench and lifted a porcelain teacup, empty now, but for a faint film clinging to the bottom. He held it to the light, turning it slowly, before setting it down again with great care. Then we begin with the household, Sinclair said, and with everyone who had reason to want Julian Castellan gone. That list, as it turned out, was not short. Julian Castellan had built his fortune buying and selling rare maps and manuscripts, a trade that had made him wealthy, but had also made him careless with the feelings of those around him. His wife, Anne, had lived apart from him for the better part of a year, following a very public and very bitter dispute over money. His business partner, Victor Renault, had recently come under suspicion of mishandling the company's accounts, though nothing had yet been proven. A rival collector named Henri Lavigne had been locked in a years-long feud with Castellan over a single map, a 16th century chart said to be worth more than the house itself. And there was the groundskeeper, old Pascal, a quiet man who had worked the courtyard gardens for over 20 years, and who, alone among the staff, held a second set of keys to every lock on the property. Sinclair began with the estranged wife Anne. She received him in the front parlour of her sister's house on Esplanade Avenue, dressed in mourning black that seemed, to Sinclair's eye, to have been prepared rather too quickly for a widow who had only just received the news. The room smelled of beeswax and old roses, and a portrait of her late father watched from above the mantel as though standing guard over the conversation. Her composure was immaculate. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, did not tremble at all. "Detective Sinclair," she said, "I understand you have questions." "I do," Sinclair said, taking the seat across from her. "When did you last see your husband?" 3 days ago, she said. "We do not live under the same roof any longer, as I imagine you already know. He came here to discuss the terms of our separation. It did not go well." "In what way?" "He was cruel," she said simply. "He told me I would see nothing from his estate unless I agreed to his terms. He always did enjoy holding money over people's heads. It was, I think, the only language he truly spoke." "And where were you last night?" "Here," she said, "at my sister's home. She will confirm it, I'm sure, along with the maid who brought us our supper, and the cousin who stayed until nearly 11, playing cards with us in this very room." "You seem to have thought carefully about your alibi, Mrs. Castellan." "I have thought carefully about everything since the day I married that man, Detective," she said, and for the first time, a flicker of something sharper crossed her face before she smoothed it away again. Sinclair thanked her and made his way next to the offices of Victor Renault, a tall man with ink-stained fingers and the restless energy of someone who had not slept well in weeks. The office smelled of old paper and lamp oil, ledgers stacked in uneven towers across every surface, as though Renault had been searching through years of records in a hurry. "I know how this looks," Renault said, before Sinclair had even finished his first question. "Julian and I disagreed over the accounts. He believed I had taken money that was not mine to take. I did not kill him, Detective. Whatever else you may think of me, I am not a murderer." "What exactly did he believe you had taken?" "Figures mostly," Renault said, waving a hand toward the ledgers. Discrepancies he claimed to have found in the shipping accounts. I told him I would go through every page myself and prove him wrong. I have been doing exactly that, in fact, every night this week. Where were you last night? Here, Renaud said, working late on the ledgers, trying to prove my innocence before he could prove my guilt. My clerk can confirm it. I never left this office. And yet you have the look of a man carrying more weight than a set of ledgers would explain, Sinclair observed. Renaud's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, and Sinclair did not press the point yet. Some threads he had learned were better pulled slowly. Next on Sinclair's list of interviews was Castellan's competitor, Henri Lavigne. He found him in his private study surrounded by maps pinned to every wall. Each map was labelled in careful handwriting, Sinclair noted. The room lit by a dozen small lamps that gave the space the feel of a chapel devoted entirely to old geography. He was a small, precise man with the manner of someone who measured his words as carefully as he measured his charts. Julien Castellan was a thief, Lavigne said, without any prompting at all. He knew that map belonged to me by rights. He outbid me at auction out of pure spite, nothing more. Strong words for a man who has just lost a rival, Sinclair observed. I did not kill him for a map, detective, Lavigne said, though I confess there were nights I dreamed of it. I was here, at home, all of last evening. My housekeeper will tell you the same. I have no gift for lying, and no talent for climbing walls either, if that is what you are wondering. I have not yet mentioned any walls, Monsieur Lavigne. Lavigne's precise composure faltered, just slightly, before he recovered it. No, he admitted, you have not. Lavigne stood and walked across the room, Sinclair noticing a limp in this left leg. You appear injured, Mr. Lavigne, Sinclair observed. Perhaps suffered from a climbing incident. If I could only attempt such a thing, Lavigne responded, pointing to a cane that was leaning on the wall beside the door. I was thrown from a horse as a young man, and I've relied on that stick ever since. Is that so? Sinclair asked. Indeed it is, Lavigne replied. You can ask anyone who knows me. I will, Sinclair said, and thanked him for his time before seeing himself out. Old Pascal, the groundskeeper, proved harder to draw out. He answered every question with as few words as possible, his weathered hands never quite still as he spoke, worrying at the brim of his hat. I tend the garden, detective, he said. I lock the gate each night at 10, same as always. Mr. Castellan liked his privacy after dark, said the courtyard was the one place in the world nobody could bother him. And the keys? I keep my own set for the tools in the shed. Never had cause to use them after dark, not once in 20 years. Before leaving the Castellan house that first afternoon, Sinclair asked to see the study where Castellan had spent most of his final days. It was a narrow room lined floor to ceiling with maps in glass-fronted cabinets, the air thick with the smell of old vellum and pipe tobacco. A single chair sat pulled back from the desk, as though its owner had risen from it in a hurry and never returned to set it straight. He opened the top drawer and found a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, correspondence between Castellan and his lawyer concerning the terms of the separation from his wife. Beneath them lay a second stack, unbound, written in a hand Sinclair recognized from the company ledgers as Victor Renaud's own. The letters were businesslike on the surface, full of talk of shipments and accounts, but there was a strain running through them that no amount of polite language could quite disguise. One line, near the bottom of the final letter, caught his eye and held it. I trust we can settle this between us. without need for lawyers or the captain's men. Sinclair read it twice before folding the letter carefully and slipping it into his coat. He also found, tucked behind a row of atlases, a small brass key that fit no lock he could find anywhere in the house. He turned it over in his palm for a long moment, turning the puzzle it presented, before setting it aside in his notebook for later. Not every detail in a case revealed itself on the first pass. Some simply waited, patient as the man who had hidden them. Odile, when he questioned her a second time, mentioned almost as an afterthought that Castellan had complained of the tea tasting bitter the night before, a small thing she had thought nothing of at the time. Sinclair asked her to describe exactly who had prepared that tea and who might have had access to the kitchen in the hours before it was served. Her answers narrowed nothing definitively, but they confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. The poison had entered the house through no dramatic means at all, but through the quiet, ordinary rhythm of an evening that no one thought to watch closely. Sinclair left each interview with more questions than answers. Every suspect had a reason to want Julian Castellan dead. Every suspect claimed to have been somewhere else when it happened. And still, the courtyard remained locked, sealed, and impossible. For 2 days, Sinclair found himself no closer to an answer. He returned again and again to the courtyard, walking its perimeter, studying the glass-protected wall, the fountain. He examined the drain pipes, the gutters, the thick jasmine vines that had climbed nearly to the roof line over the years. He questioned Odile a second time, then a third, searching for some detail she might have overlooked. He examined Castellan's private study, his correspondence, his half-finished cup of tea from the night before. Nothing gave him what he needed. He sat that evening in his agency office, the case file spread across his desk, and allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, a genuine moment of doubt. Perhaps the courtyard truly had no answer. Perhaps some tragedies simply refused to make sense, no matter how carefully one searched for their shape. The lamp on his desk had burned low, and outside his window the sound of a distant streetcar rattled past, indifferent to the puzzle keeping him from sleep. It was Eleanor Whitmore who found him there, staring at nothing, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. By day, Eleanor Whitmore is an unassuming society lady whose sharp wit is often mistaken for harmless curiosity. By night, she becomes Edwin W. Blackwood, one of New Orleans' most respected and relentless crime reporters. No one suspects the city's boldest newspaper columnist is a woman, and she goes to great lengths to ensure it stays that way. When Sinclair had realized the truth about Edwin W. Blackwood, he had genuinely surprised himself that he hadn't figured it out earlier. Blackwood had been the bane of his investigations, beating him on details, rumors, and confessions on a regular basis in a very public manner. His reluctant professional respect was now correctly directed to the uninvited woman standing in his study. "You look like a man who has lost an argument with himself," Eleanor said, throwing a copy of the evening newspaper on his desk in front of him. She then sat down without waiting for an invitation, as she always did. "Hello, Nellie," Sinclair said, using the nickname he knew she found irritating. "What you in fact see is a man trying to solve an impossible case. A locked courtyard, poison, no visible way for anyone to have reached the victim. A real crime, not just some story to titillate your readers." He looked at the newspaper headline. It read, "Castellan investigation reveals nothing." He let out a quiet sigh of resignation. "And you've questioned everyone who might have wanted him dead?" Eleanor asked. "Everyone," Sinclair said, "and each of them has an answer for where they were. Eleanor tilted her head, tapping one gloved finger on the arm of her chair. You know, Detective, my sources tell me Victor Renault has been seen quite often at the tailor's shop next door to the Castellan house. Something about having a coat altered. Strange thing to need altered so many times, don't you think? Sinclair sat up slightly. The tailor's shop. It shares a wall with the courtyard. Does it now? Eleanor said. And though her tone was light, her eyes were sharp with the same instinct that had made her the best reporter in the city, even under a man's byline. I only mention it because it seemed curious. I do love a curious detail. My sources hear things your officers never will, Detective. It is the great advantage of talking to people who are never asked their opinion on anything important. Your instincts are, on occasion, sometimes helpful in minor ways, Sinclair said, already reaching for his coat. Perhaps, Eleanor said, with a small, satisfied smile. But my instincts will also be the main story in tomorrow's Daily Picayune. Sinclair returned to the Castellan property that same evening and climbed, with Murphy's help, onto the roof of the tailor's shop next door. The rooftops of the French Quarter stretched out around him in the fading light, a patchwork of slate and tin catching the last orange glow of the sunset, chimney smoke curling lazily into a sky gone the colour of a bruise. From there, he could see clearly what he had missed before, a narrow gap between the two rooftops, easily crossed by anyone willing to risk the jump, and beyond it, a drain pipe running down the party wall directly into the courtyard. Half hidden behind the jasmine vines, he followed the length of the drain pipe closely and found at the top of the wall just above it a small torn scrap of dark wool fabric. Sinclair returned to Castellan's office and looked around. He examined the books and the maps lining the walls. He stopped in front of an elaborately framed map of early New Orleans. He ran his hands along the edges of the frame, gliding along its smooth, polished wood. As he felt the top of the frame, his fingers touched two small metal hinges, not visible when looking straight at the map. He then bent down and looked at the bottom of the frame and saw a small lock. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the key he had located on an earlier visit to the office. He inserted it and turned. The lock clicked and the frame swung open a few inches, causing a leather-bound ledger to fall to the floor. Sinclair picked it up and opened it. Inside he found pages of small, careful entries, dates and figures written in Castellan's tight handwriting. He tucked the ledger under his arm and left the office. Sinclair had officers Murphy and Dubois gather everyone at the Castellan house the following evening. His wife Anne Castellan, business partner Victor Renault, rival collector Henri Lavigne, Odile the housekeeper, and old Pascal the groundskeeper all sat in the lavishly appointed parlour, along with Murphy, Dubois, and Eleanor Whitmore near the back, notebook already in hand. A man was found dead in a courtyard that no one could enter, Sinclair began. For 2 days, I believed the answer lay with someone already inside these walls. I was wrong. The answer lay above them. He turned first to Adriana Castellan. Mrs. Castellan, I considered you closely. You had every reason to resent your husband, but the law is clear on one point. Any wife found guilty of her husband's murder forfeits her claim to the estate entirely. You stood to gain far more from a courtroom than from a courtyard. Killing him would have cost you everything you were fighting for. Anne Castellan said nothing, but she did not look away either. Sinclair turned next to Henri Lavigne. You hated Castellan. You said so yourself more than once. But you also lean on that cane of yours with every step you take. The roof next door requires a jump most healthy men would think twice about. You could not have made that climb, Monsieur Lavigne, and we both know it. Lavigne gave a small, tight nod, saying nothing. As for you, Pascal, and you, Odile, Sinclair went on, I looked hard for a motive and found none worth the name. Castellan's will leaves you both only a small stipend, nothing more. I suspect both of you are surprised by the news a man such as Castellan would consider leaving you anything at all. Regardless, a man does not risk the gallows for a few dollars a month. Pascal shifted in his seat. Odile pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and stayed quiet. Sinclair turned to Renaud. Julien Castellan had accused you of defrauding the company. Whether you are guilty of that crime or not, I have not determined. But you knew that if Castellan could not find evidence of your guilt in the company records, he would simply create his own records. You knew the nature of the man you were in business with, and you knew his forgeries were very, very good. You also knew such a charge would not only be the ruin of you, but also very likely prison. Confronted with an impossible situation, you attempted to solve it with an impossible crime. You knew his routine of evening tea in the courtyard and decided the coward's poison was your method of choice. The hardest part would be getting the poison to Castellan without being obvious. But luckily, you were a patron of the tailor next door. You are also tall enough and desperate enough to make the leap from the rooftop of the tailor's shop. Your target of his tea would be sitting out just waiting for you. Once your nefarious task was complete, you used the drain pipe to make your way back up and over the wall. Sinclair paused his story and looked squarely at Renaud. Renaud's face had gone pale, but he said nothing. Sinclair produced the scrap of dark wool from his coat pocket and held it up for the room to see. It is a match for the coat you brought in 3 times this week to have mended. This is absurd, Renaud said, his voice cracking despite his effort to sound calm. A scrap of fabric proves nothing. Half the men in this city own a coat of that same cloth. Perhaps, Sinclair said. Which is why I had Officer Dubois retrieve your jacket. Dubois stepped forward and held up Renaud's grey jacket. Sinclair handed Dubois the torn scrap. Dubois found the tailor's patch on the jacket and held the scrap over it. Perfect fit, he observed. It was Eleanor, watching from the back of the room, who noticed Renaud's hand drift toward his coat pocket, and it was Murphy who crossed the room fast enough to stop him before he could reach whatever was inside it. What they found was a small glass vial of the same poison that had killed Julien Castellan. Victor Renaud did not deny it further. He confessed quietly, almost with relief, as though the weight of the secret had grown heavier than the fear of being caught. He had never intended murder, he said, until he learned Castellan had made a copy of the company's ledger, and it was clear he had no other way out. Ruin or worse, and he had chosen worse for someone else instead. He had watched Castellan for weeks, learning the pattern of his evenings, the hour he took his tea, the 10 o'clock lock of the courtyard gate that would leave the garden sealed, and he had believed entirely beyond suspicion. In the weeks that followed, the Castellan estate was settled, though not without its own quiet dramas, and Castellan received far less than she had hoped, though considerably more than her late husband had threatened, and she left the city not long after for a quieter life somewhere upriver. Henri Lavigne, in a gesture no one quite expected, purchased the disputed map from the estate at a fair auction price rather than trying to claim it through underhanded means, as though some part of the ordeal had reminded him what his rivalry had already cost him. Old Pascal kept his position tending the courtyard gardens, the jasmine vines trimmed back now from the drain pipe that had made such quiet, deadly work possible, though he confessed to Odile that he never again looked at that stretch of wall without a small shiver of unease. Victor Renault stood trial that autumn and was found guilty within a single afternoon, the confession in the parlour taking centre stage. The ledger, scrap of wool and vial of poison also proved more than enough for any jury in New Orleans to convict. Sinclair returned to the courtyard one final time before the case was closed, standing alone beside the fountain in the fading evening light. It was a strange thing, he thought, how a space could be locked on every side and still not be safe. The city around him carried on the way it always did, indifferent to the small tragedies unfolding within its walls, the river moving steadily past the wharves, the gas lamps flickering on along Royal Street, the sound of a fiddle drifting faintly from some open window a few streets over. Eleanor found him there, as she so often did, leaning against the courtyard gate with her arms crossed and a knowing look on her face. "You could have told me sooner it was the roof," she said. "Saved yourself 2 days of staring at that fountain." "I could have," Sinclair admitted, "but then you would never let me forget it." "No," she said, allowing herself a small smile. "I certainly would not." "You never do," Sinclair said, and for once there was no irritation in his response at all, only something close to gratitude, however unwilling he was to name it that plainly. He knew the unwanted competition made him sharper. They walked out together into the cooling evening air, past the broken glass set into the courtyard wall, a barrier that had never once considered the danger might come from above. Behind them, the fountain trickled on quietly in the dark, the jasmine vines swaying gently along a wall that had finally given up its secret